a way through the sea, a path through mighty waters, who drew out the chariots and horses, the army and reinforcements together, and they lay there, never to rise again, extinguished, snuffed out like a wick. Forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and the streams in the wasteland. May God bless this reading.
Growing in our spiritual life requires something more of us. Let me say it again because some people aren't listening. Growing in our spiritual life requires something more of us. Yes. Well, I'm going to tell you. And you already know, I don't really have to tell you. But recently, we have seen how streams can spring up.
Oh, yeah.
I was walking in my neighborhood the other day, yesterday, I think it was the day before. It wasn't raining, but when I was walking, I was like, oh, look at that. It's bubbling up out of the ground. It's just like coming right up out of the ground. Amazing. Amazing. Now, nature is stronger than we are. You know the saying, don't mess with Mother Nature. Or how about the saying, you can't fool Mother Nature either. Well, I believe it. I do believe that is a powerful image of the Mother Nature of God, the Mother image of God, which we need that Mother image of God just as much as we need a Father image of God. And so for those of you who have struggled with inclusive language, I want you to know that there are images of the Mother image of God. Just as much as, well, maybe not because it's a patriarchal thing when the books were written and all that, but there is a powerful idea that God is also Mother, nurturing. Now, I hate to put that into categories because, you know, even as a woman pastor, there's certain expectations that are put on a woman pastor than there are on a male pastor. And rightly or not, it's true. I digress. We've come to this time in our history more than ever when I believe we must be about God's business. Yeah. The new spiritual thing God has in store for us really is surely not what I had imagined. It's not what I imagined. This is a new day. One that will require more of us, not less. It will require more of us, more spiritual tenacity than we ever dreamed before. We must be willing to show up. Our history reminds us that we must not remain silent when injustice is done. We must not take for granted the freedoms that we have been given. And I think some of us have taken those for granted. And we must remember, as people of faith, that God is not finished with us just yet. It has been people of faith who have stood up time and time again, over and over and over. On this Sunday, we approach Martin Luther King's birthday. And I was thinking of the impact that he had on my own life. His faith called me to a new spiritual height, even as he went to places where he was told not to go. I believe that God's plan looks beyond what we see. And behind what we may seem as futile to that which is unseen, to that which is unexpected. I still believe there's something greater to come, even if I have to remind myself every minute. And lately I've had to remind myself every minute that God's plan requires that I give all that I have to make a difference. God's plan requires that you give what you have to make a difference. Paul reminds us in our Corinthians reading for today that God is faithful. God is faithful. I believe God is faithful. I have to remind myself, though. And George said something about, God shows up. It's been my experience that God is usually never early, but never late. Seldom early, but never late. So, God's plan requires our willingness to participate in the world around us. And so tomorrow I will be marching in the MLK March if somebody wants to join. On next Saturday I will be marching in the Women's March if you want to join with me. I will be taking to the streets. I believe God is faithful and calls us to move beyond our own insecurities and lack of faithfulness to the faithfulness of God. We are called to work and to live toward new spiritual heights, whatever they are. And each one of us has a different idea of what those spiritual heights might be. I want to quote Dr. Martin Luther King, who said this, and I've used this in the pastor's pen before, so if it sounds familiar, that's where you've probably heard it. He said this: everybody can be great because anybody can serve. That means you. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and verb agree to serve. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love. Great quote. We can serve. And I believe that he's right. I believe that we are all called to serve. I keep telling myself to figure it out. Figure it out. How can I be more motivating? Figure it out. How can I do what I need to do? Figure it out. See, my job isn't to keep my job. My job is to serve God while I work on justice and this radically inclusive stuff that God has given us to do. And we need to work together. We and I will continue to keep talking. I will continue to keep walking. I will continue to live into what that looks like, even though it has cost me family and it has cost me friends. And you know that because some of you, it has cost you the same thing. It has cost you family and it has cost you friends. But saints, I'm not worried about that now because God is faithful. God is faithful. We are our brothers and our sisters' keepers. Genesis reminds us of our brother's blood being carried up from the ground. And today on this Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, I believe that Dr. King's blood might be just coming up from the ground, echoing the words of St. Paul from Galatians that says, there is no longer Jew nor Greek. There is no longer slave nor free. There is no longer male nor female, for we are all one in Christ Jesus. Amen. Oh, that we can understand that with our hearts. Oh, that we can understand that with our hearts. And so I was thinking, and I put to pen a letter that I decided to write to Dr. King. Now I know that he's going to read it in the spirit. And this is the letter that I wrote. Dear Dr. King, I want you to know that you helped to change my life. At a young age, I thought of God a God who was somewhere out there. But you see, you made God real for me. My parents taught me to trust in good people. And at 12 years old, you were my first hero, since you were the best person that I could think of. I was reading your stories and your sermons growing up in the 60s and the 70s of the spiritual height and the new direction. You were calling people to go. The day you were killed, April 4th, 1968, is one I remember as a young girl in grade school. I remember that day. And I think back and I realize that that's 49 years ago. But it could be today. But it could be today. Dr. King, you were one of many openings to God for me as I grew into a young person and made me who I am today. You taught me God's love is larger, in a larger sense than I could ever imagine. As an adult, I listened to many times to your I Have a Dream speech. And every time I listen, it moves me often to tears. I'm still in awe of your courage, your soaring rhetoric, your insistence on peaceably showing up where you weren't wanted. And I often still struggle with the idea of where God has placed me. But you spurred on by principle much larger than your comfort zone, much larger than some set of rules. And I realize that I have had the luxury and comfort over working for justice because of the color of my skin. And I'm sorry. The truth is, I have tried to take the spiritual high ground that you first treaded so many years ago. You taught me, Dr. King, before anyone else did, that what God's love looks like, what God's love feels like, what God's love sounds like. Cornel West said, never forget that justice is what love looks like in public. And for me, Dr. King, you lived that. Not for just me, but for us. You lived that. And God's love, you taught me, doesn't look like hearts on some cards or posted on Facebook, but you taught me that God's love looks like marching and civil disobedience and singing in the streets and community events and walking toward danger with bravery, facing down fire hoses and billy clubs and even bullets with nothing but the shirt on your back and the word of God in your heart. You taught me. Amen. You taught me that God's love looks like integrity. And you said, no justice, no peace. You taught me that God's love looks like standing up for the oppressed people on the margins, even if it's unpopular, even if it causes public scorn, even if it means dying. You taught me that God's love meant praying for your enemies, turning the other cheek, forgiving them, refusing to give up. You taught me that no one is free until all are free. You taught me that God's love is like being caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied to a garment of destiny. That I belong in the web of humanity. That we belong in the web of humanity. I could no more extract myself from creating false boundaries any more than I could fly. Of course, I know that you learned all of that from Jesus. I know that you learned that from Moses. I know that you learned that from St. Paul and from the prophets. And so I thank you for leading me and us up to the mountain for a glimpse of God and God's promises, knowing that God is faithful. And lastly, you said in your last speech these words, and I quote, "Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop, and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And God's allowed me to go up to the mountain and to look over. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, we will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything, and I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." Respectfully, Reverend Terri Miller. Mine eyes have seen the coming of the glory of the Lord. Perhaps, saints, we are called to a new thing. That God has put us in this place for this era. We may need a crash helmet and a life preserver, right, for the new thing that God is doing. But let me be very clear. Let me be very clear. You and I have work to do as we take the spiritual journey, as we take the spiritual high ground, as we take on this mantle of faithfulness that God is calling us to walk into. I pray that we will walk together to the next place that God is calling us to go. Amen? Amen. Amen.